this lesson, we're going to look at customizing properties in Rhino. Now, this isn't to be confused with object properties, which is this rainbow-colored ring you'll find in the toolbar. Object properties has to do with specific objects within your file. The properties we're going to look at customizing today actually have to do with the document itself or the way that you interact with Rhino. To access the Properties menu, we can either click on this cog shape in the toolbar, or we can simply go to File and then select Properties. And you'll see a window pops up. If you look over here on the left, you can see a whole long list of different options that are available. And this can look a little intimidating. So let's go ahead and simplify how this looks. I'll just click on this minus sign by Rhino Options, and then I'll click on this minus sign by Document Properties. So that's much simpler now. So what you'll find is we actually have options that will affect Rhino overall, and those can be found under Rhino Options. And then we also have Document Properties, and those apply to the specific file that you happen to be working on. They also travel with the file. So once these are set, if you email the file to somebody or you take this file and work on a different computer, it's going to take those settings with it. Let's go ahead and look at the Rhino options first. I'll just go ahead and open this up. And for the most part, you aren't going to need to change a whole lot of things in here. Rhino runs fairly well by itself. I do like to customize a couple of things. The first thing I always do when I'm launching Rhino on a new computer or using it for the first time after an install is I'll click on the General tab, and you can see right here is a section called Undo. This controls the minimum number of undos available whenever you're working in Rhino. As you can see, the minimum number is set to 1, and the max memory used is set to 16. This doesn't mean you'll only have one undo. What this means is you'll have a minimum of 1, and you'll have as many undos as are available until you max out this 16 meg limit. So I like to make a couple of changes here. The first one is I always set this to at least 10 undos. And then for max memory, I always set this to 512 meg. On most 3D computers now, you're typically running with an excess of RAM, so I haven't had any problems setting this to 512. If you're running less memory on your computer, you might want to set this to a larger number. But I would always set this higher than the minimum of 16. The next thing I like to always change is the appearance. If we come up here to the Appearance category, and we'll just open this plus sign up. If I click on Colors, you can see I have all these different swatches available. These are actually controlling how my interface looks. So for example, if I click on Background, this gray square, I'll just change this to something kind of strange to illustrate the point. Once I click OK on this, you can see the background is changed to a bright green color. And you can go ahead and set any of these colors to whatever you really like to work with. Don't worry though, if you make a mistake and you don't like how it looks, you can always click on Restore Defaults, and it'll take you back to the default settings. The other options I like to adjust in here is under Advanced Settings. If I click on that and open it up, you can see that it lists wireframe, shaded, rendered, and several others. These all have to do with our different view settings. So if you remember under Perspective, if we click on that, we have the option to choose whether your file is rendered in wireframe mode, shaded mode, ghosted mode, or several others. This individually adjusts how each of these modes react. So for example, I'm currently in shaded mode back here. Let me move the window up a little bit so you can see a bit more of the background. And for this, I can individually set the background settings. So I can choose a gradient of 2 colors, and you can see the background immediately chose to a gradient. I can customize that if I like. So if I go to a white for the top color, and maybe a nice blue for that lower color, you can see immediately the background is changed to that. I can also adjust how the objects appear. So by default, shaded mode is set to object color. If I click on this, I can choose single color for all objects, and everything in there will change to whatever my single object color is. I'll switch this back to object colors. I can also change the transparency of objects. If I click on this and type in 75, you can see the objects become transparent. You move this window out of the way so you can see a little better. Now they're transparent. Again, if I make some kind of mistake that I don't like how it looks, I can restore the defaults on that. So those are probably the two main areas I actually customize whenever I'm working in Rhino. Remember, these Rhino option changes I've made are specific to the particular machine I'm running on, and these changes do not travel with the actual data file. Go ahead and minimize that, and we'll look at the document properties. Now remember, any changes to the document properties we make do travel with the file. So again, if you email this file to somebody or you take it and work on another computer, any of the changes we make now will travel with that file. When you create a new file for a new project, these changes will not be in there. You'll have to individually change them or set up a custom template if you like. So there's a couple of settings in here that are very important. The first of these, and probably the most important, is units. And this you need to set before you actually start working on a model. You can change this after you start working on a model, but any changes you make to absolute tolerance will only apply to new data that you create. It does not go back and reapply this new tolerance to anything that is existing already. So when we look at the modeling units, we click on this, and you can see we have all the typical options. You have millimeters, centimeters, inches, feet. And as you get further down the list, you get into some more sort of strange objects. You've got astronomical units, light years, parsecs. Now remember, these can be changed at any point, so I can always change to inches, even though I've created everything in millimeters. And if I were to click OK, this would ask me if I want to scale everything, and it would change it so that it's the same dimension, just now in inches. Go ahead and set that back to millimeters. Absolute tolerance, as I mentioned, is really the important one that you want to focus on. For millimeters, this is a great setting. This gives me 3 decimal places to the right of 0, so I know anything I build in millimeters will have a high enough resolution or tolerance for a typical consumer-sized product. You don't want to go too low with this, let's say to a 1.0, because there just isn't enough accuracy in the model to create precise data. I'll go ahead and reset this to 0.1, but let me exit out of this and show you an example of what I'm talking about. You can see in this particular shape here, I have a radius of 0.25, and it looks pretty good. But if I go ahead and switch this layer on, this is exactly the same 2.5 millimeter fillet applied to the exact same model, but because the tolerance was set to 1, not 0.001, there wasn't enough accuracy in the model for it to create the part, and as you can see, the shape can fail completely. It's kind of exploded the whole shape. So you can see how important it is to have the tolerances set correctly. Let me just go ahead and zoom in on this corner to set up for the next thing that I wanted to show you. As you can see, when I zoom in on this corner, there are all sorts of little gaps here. These are called facets. This is because the mesh isn't set high enough, and the mesh settings define how well your model renders and how it displays in any of the shaded modes. So I'll go ahead and click on this icon to bring up the options, and I'll click on mesh. You can see it's set to jagged and faster. If I switch this to smooth and slower, and then click preview, you'll notice those go away. Now the mesh settings are high enough that even very detailed parts are going to render correctly and look correct in our shaded mode preview. Let me hit OK on this and just back out a little bit so that we can see our dimensions a little clearer. Okay, so as you can see, we have a radius of 0.25 and we have a width of 9.57 millimeters. I'll go back into the properties and I'll go down to dimensions and I'll click on the default dimension. By default, the text height is set to 1 millimeter and the precision is set to 2 decimal places. I can change all of that if I'm not getting enough information or if I'm getting too much information for a specific file. I'll go ahead and just set that to 1 with no decimal points. Click preview. So now you can see my dimensions have changed. This has rounded itself up to 10, and my radius, because it was less than 1, has actually rounded itself down to 0. So obviously that's not a very good setting. Let me go ahead and bring in another decimal place to that and hit preview. And now my radius is rounded up to 1 decimal place, which in this instance works pretty good. As I said, you can change the text height. If your text isn't large enough for what you're working on, you can go ahead and change that to a larger number, let's say a 2. Click preview. And you can see the measurements are much larger now. Or if it's too large, I can pick a smaller number, hit preview, and now it's reduced in size greatly. I'll just go ahead and set that back to 1, and I'll give it a precision of 2 again. Keep in mind that the dimension settings does not have a default button, so you do have to kind of remember where it was. So those are really the 3 main things I changed that are going to actually travel with the model itself. Let's go ahead and click OK to get out of that. As I mentioned when we were looking at the unit tolerances, you want to set that up right from the beginning. And a really good way to do that is whenever you start a file, is to use one of the templates. So let me just go ahead and click on New. I'll just say no to saving changes. And now it's showing me template files. If I click on Small Object Millimeters, which is the one I typically use, you can see under the notes, it's telling me this template is for building objects the size of a truck or smaller, and for objects which must be built to manufacturing tolerances. If I'm going to work on something larger, let's say a building, I might click on Large Objects Feet. And here you can see under notes, this template file is for building objects the size of a truck or larger. And you can see the tolerance here is much larger than it was in Small Object Millimeters. It's actually set to 0.01 of a foot. So just keep in mind when you're starting a project, what type of project you're working on, and what the overall size of that project is. And that concludes our look at the Rhino properties.